Garrett, let's go to the other side of the Lane Kiffin drama for our next one. And we got to ask the question, is Ole Miss better off with Pete Golding? Because obviously, I think a lot of people counted them out when Lane Kiffin left. Yes, they were going to be in the college football playoff. Yes, they were like 98% likely to win their first round game against Tulane. But after that, it was going to be just a bloodbath against Georgia. Georgia was just going to waltz right into the semifinals against a coachless Ole Miss team. And then Pete Golding had Ole Miss a sniff away from playing for a national championship with how close that game ended up being, not just with Georgia where they won, but in the semifinal as well. So I think it's fair to ask the question, is Pete Golding a great fit for Ole Miss? And, being someone that is going to stick around, it looks like, and build a program for the long term if he keeps winning, is that a better situation for Ole Miss?
He's won 2 playoff games, and Lane hadn't won any yet. So, I mean, probably the answer is an obvious yes, right? Look, I wrote this down too. I mean, Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin 1-2 against Georgia, 0-4 against Bama, and he was 1-1 against other teams ranked in the top 5 when he played them. Their last win, or their only win, really, I guess, was last season against number 4 LSU, and we can roll our eyes at what number 4 LSU really meant at the time. But that's just kind of how those games ended up working themselves out. Look, I think Pete Golding is a very good hire for this team. I think it's a very good hire. I think it was a smart hire when they did it. I think to keep everything in house, to try to do the whole chip on a shoulder thing and see if they can make a run. I think it clearly worked. I mean, they were like an errant pass, like on the last drive away from winning that football game and playing in the national championship. And not to say that like it was an obvious pass he should have made that. Like I'm not saying that. Like it was well covered. It just was a little overthrown. But look, I mean, end of the day, this is a really good hire. I think he's a really good coach. I think he clearly showed that. I mean, it's funny to think that he will enter his first full season with Ole Miss having been with Ole Miss as the head football coach in these semifinals. Like that's kind of funny to think that like, oh, we got our new coach, the guy from last year that brought us almost all the way to the pinnacle. I think it's a really good hire. I think that Ole Miss, it's hard to say better off. I know we're being a little bit provocative with the wording there, but I do think that there is something to be said about bringing in a coach who can get the most out of your players, kind of get that chip on his shoulder, right? Because the reality for Ole Miss is even when Lane Kiffin was there, they probably weren't going to pull in like top 5 to top 10 talent classes every year, right? It's just not really what Ole Miss can draw. I know, especially with like some of the NIL commitments and stuff like that, some of the things that Lane was complaining about when he left, that's not going to be a reality, right? Like as much as we love Trinidad Chambliss, he was not, 5-star, highly heralded, and then we developed him type of guy. He was a really good talent evaluation plus development plus system, right? So when you have a guy like that, you can kind of say you got a little bit of hunger there, right? You're coming up from the lower levels. You got some hunger to prove yourself. Plus, you're talented. Plus, you can do it. Plus a good system and the entire rest of it. Like that's where you start to succeed. And I think if you can continue to get that from Pete Golding saying like, hey, keep that chip on your shoulder. They don't believe in us. They don't think we can, but I know that we can, right? Kind of go like us versus the world type of thing. I think that's where Ole Miss probably succeeds the most is when they got their back against the wall. Nobody thinks they can do it. And then they go out there and they punch you in the face and they show like, hey, we're actually a pretty dominant SEC team. Doesn't have all to do with Lane Kiffin. It actually is just kind of who we are.
I I think this offseason is going to be really telling
Mm-hmm.
because Pete Golding, no head coach experience, at least not at this level, right? I think it's going to be really difficult for him to make the transition to managing a program the size of Ole Miss without any real huge experience to draw back on. Now, I will say he did a fantastic job keeping everybody on the same page through that playoff run because there was so much chaos. There was the former head coach trying to sabotage what they were doing by being squirrely with when his assistants could be in person, when they could be in meetings, all that stuff. It was just a mess. And he managed it really, really well. And like I said, when we were talking about Kiffin, he had him within a sneeze of playing for a national championship. But it's it's just different being the full-time head coach. And I know that Golding knew that he was going to have the job, but having the full offseason, having it all be your call is just very different. And some guys just can't make that jump from successful coordinator to successful big time head coach. So it's going to be really interesting. I think this season, even though they will have Trinidad Chambliss back, it looks like, with a lot of lawsuits, I guess, still to be decided there. It looks like everything's going to be okay there, and that's a firm foundation to build around. That's probably going to be worth a couple wins in and of itself. But how much different are the offensive meetings going to be this year without Lane Kiffin kind of grounding that room? How much different are just the general vibes of the program going to be as Pete Golding tries to decide this is what I'm going to do versus what Lane tried to do, and just trying to find his own identity for the program? Year one could be really interesting with those regards. The only parallel I can think of, Garrett, is not a football one. I think it's going to our baseball team when Texas A&M lost Jim Schlossnagle to Texas, and Michael Early suddenly was just thrown into being a head man for the first time. Obviously, a lot lower, uh, fewer eyeballs on a college baseball program than an SEC football program. But even then, it was pretty obvious that there were a lot of struggles and things that he needed to figure out, that he was just trying to learn on the job. We'll see how that turns out in Texas A&M. But for Ole Miss, I think that there could be some growing pains in 2026.
Sure, and I think a lot of Ole Miss fans probably acknowledge that it may not be a perfect transition, but as long as he can keep them competitive and towards the top, it should be okay. I think the thing that I would really be excited about is, even though, and I was going to go the same place with that comparison, so I'm glad we're on the same wavelength at least. The one thing that I'll give him a little bit of credit for is, Jim Schlossnagle managed all the way up to that final game in the College World Series. Michael Early didn't, right? That's the when you're looking at Pete Golding, like, he did take the entire playoff run, like he was able to manage that, and I think that does something not just for like, yeah, the culture and kind of what I was saying with like keeping the chip on your shoulder and all that, but I think it also gives a lot of confidence from the guys in the room that, okay, if he can manage through this situation, he can manage an off-season workout schedule, and he can manage like fall ball and making a good decision for, who's going to be our starting left tackle and all of that. Like, that's going to be something that he can manage because he was able to manage, personnel stuff coming in and out, and who's going to be here and who's not going to be here, and who's going to be coaching this, and kind of moving pieces around as people were leaving to head to Baton Rouge. Uh, I think he gets some credit for that. Now, naturally, there's a lot of other things that go into being a head coach, right? And you kind of mentioned some of them with like NIL and your roster construction and all the other duties of like, being the face of the program and showing up to the baseball games and making sure that you're out there to be seen for all the people and doing the radio show and, getting in front of parents when it's time to go sign that last kid to this, whatever. Like, that's all a big deal, right? That's all a huge thing that is a separate deal that he didn't have to deal with in December and January. But I do think that it's something he'll be able to handle, because I think for me, I've seen that he can do that at the high level of like the chaos of a coaching transition and still succeed. I think I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on this one. Now, do I think that he has the same ceiling maybe as Lane Kiffin? Probably not. And I hate to say it, but probably not. But I do think he's going to do a really good job at Ole Miss. And maybe he builds the right staff, builds the right program, and he develops a little bit. And then they do have that same kind of ceiling. Right now, I think a lot of Ole Miss fans would be thrilled with a return to the college football playoff under Pete Golding.
Yeah, that would unquestionably be a successful year one. But I think you talk about the ceiling with Lane Kiffin. I think so much is made about the ceiling at LSU. You think about the ceiling at Ole Miss and what we've seen that program accomplish just in the last 10, 15 years when Hugh Freeze, I know Hugh Freeze was doing a lot of stuff that was not okay 10, 15 years ago, and is
He
probably
sure was.
more, at least on the player side, not everything. I know the comments could jump in here, but from a funding standpoint,
Right.
it's less frowned upon now. There were other things that I'm sure people will jump to point out, but we
For sure.
saw. My point is, we saw when Ole Miss is able to get talent within the rules, whatever. The highs are very high, and we've now seen Hugh Freeze do it. We saw it a little bit, I guess a little bit in the in between, but especially with Lane Kiffin. I think Golding can reach the heights of having a team that's competing for a college football playoff spot. That's kind of been the ceiling for Ole Miss the last couple of years, and arguably Lane kind of held them back last year when they lost focus and were losing games down the stretch when they probably had a better team, more likely to win a national championship in 2024. So Yeah, I think long term could work out. Jury's going to still be out, but short term, I'm expecting a little bit of a rocky transition. And same quarterback or not, it's just going to be really interesting to see how Golding
Yep.
can take over that program and be the guy.